In 2002, a clinical psychologist in Israel began noticing something in his case files that didn't fit any existing diagnosis. His patients weren't delusional, they weren't dissociating, they were fully functional, and they were spending hours every day inside worlds that didn't exist. Entire lives running parallel to the one in front of them. The scenarios were detailed, the characters had histories, and the person living them could not stop. This is their case file. Welcome to the Deviation Archive, where we use psychology to understand the people who deviate from the norm. The cultural read on people who lose themselves in fantasy is not a generous one. They're called immature, checked out, stuck in a dream because the real world was too much for them. The assumption is that imagination, deployed at this scale, is a coping mechanism, a retreat from difficulty, a failure to engage. You've heard the version: head in the clouds, can't commit, confuses fiction for reality. What makes this framing so durable is that it contains a grain of truth. Some daydreaming does begin as escape, a difficult childhood, a period of isolation, a mind that learned early that the inner world was safer than the outer one. And so the instinct is to place chronic fantasizers on a spectrum with avoidance, to see the behavior as a symptom of something else. Anxiety, maybe, depression, trauma. But here's where the research starts complicating the file. When clinicians began actually studying these individuals, not as a footnote in trauma research, but as subjects in their own right, the picture that emerged didn't match the profile of someone failing to cope. The people in these studies held jobs, maintained relationships, and understood perfectly well that their imagined worlds weren't real. They weren't confused. They weren't psychotic. And critically, many of them reported that the daydreaming itself wasn't distressing. What was distressing was not being able to stop it when they needed to. That's a different problem entirely. And it points somewhere the avoidance model never thought to look. The researcher who first named what he was seeing was Eli Sommer, a clinical psychologist at the University of Haifa. In 2002, Sommer published the paper that introduced the term maladaptive daydreaming, defining it as extensive fantasy activity that replaces human interaction and interferes with academic, interpersonal, or vocational functioning. The word maladaptive was deliberate. This wasn't ordinary mind-wandering. It was a cognitive pattern with its own internal logic, its own triggers, and for many people, its own compulsive pull. What made Sommer's framing significant wasn't just the label, it was the implication. If this was a distinct pattern rather than a byproduct of something else, it deserved its own research. And that research, when it came, pointed toward neurological architecture rather than psychological weakness. A 2021 study led by Nurit Sofer-Dudek at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev found that maladaptive daydreaming shares structural features with obsessive-compulsive spectrum disorders, not mood disorders, not anxiety disorders, but conditions characterized by intrusive, repetitive mental content that the person experiences as difficult to interrupt. The daydreams, in other words, function less like chosen entertainment and more like a channel the brain defaults to, one that requires active effort to switch off. What makes this mechanistically interesting is where that default lives. The default mode network, the brain's activity during internally directed thought, is more persistently and intensely activated in people who report maladaptive daydreaming. The network that hums quietly in most people during rest becomes, in these individuals, something closer to a primary operating mode. The inner world isn't a refuge they choose, it's where their brain goes on its own. If you're the person who has sat through a conversation, a meal, an entire film, technically present, functionally elsewhere, that's not a character flaw. That's a brain doing what it is built to do, at a volume nobody told you was unusual. What this looks like on the ground, though, is something the mechanism alone doesn't fully capture. The person in this file is not, by any visible measure, absent. They laugh at the right moments. They answer questions. They navigate the day. What nobody in the room can see is that a parallel narrative has been running the entire time, one with recurring characters, unresolved storylines, and a continuity that stretches back years. sometimes decades. The scenarios are rarely random. They have internal rules. Certain characters behave consistently. Certain outcomes are off-limits. The world inside has its own physics, and the person maintaining it knows those physics better than they know some of the people they share a home with. Music is often a trigger. A specific song cues a specific scene, reliably, the way a smell retrieves a memory. Movement sometimes helps. Pacing, rocking, a repetitive physical rhythm that seems to deepen the immersion. If you're the person this file is describing, you've almost certainly never said any of this out loud. Not the full version. Not the part about the characters who have been with you since adolescence, or the storylines you return to for months at a time, or the fact that interrupting a daydream mid-scene produces something that feels uncomfortably close to frustration or grief. You've edited the confession before it left your mouth because you already know how it sounds. What you've probably said instead is that you have a vivid imagination, which is true, but it's not the whole truth, and you know that. Here is what the research actually found. In a 2016 study by Jane Bigelson and colleagues at Pace University, individuals reporting maladaptive daydreaming showed significantly elevated rates of dissociative absorption, the capacity to become so immersed in internal experience that external stimuli recede almost entirely. This isn't a skill they developed, it's a trait they have. And like most cognitive traits distributed across a population, it clusters. It shows up alongside ADHD, OCD, and trauma histories at rates that are not coincidental. Not because those conditions cause the daydreaming, but because they share an underlying neurological signature, a brain that struggles to regulate the direction of its own attention. The culture has read this as dysfunction. What the file actually shows is a cognitive system running at unusually high intensity in a particular direction, and a person who has spent years learning to manage something nobody gave them a name for. Here is the case as it actually stands. Maladaptive daydreaming has no entry in the DSM, the official catalog of recognized mental disorders. It has no formal diagnostic code. A person can walk into a psychiatrist's office describing a fantasy life that consumes 4, 6, 8 hours of their day, one that is interfering with their work, their relationships, their ability to be present in their own life, and leave without a diagnosis because the framework to contain what they're describing does not yet officially exist. That's not a minor administrative gap. It means an entire population of people experiencing real functional impairment have no clinical language for what's happening to them, no treatment protocol designed for them, and no way to explain themselves to a professional without sounding like they're describing a preference rather than a pattern. The research has been accumulating for over 2 decades. The clinical infrastructure has not followed. What makes this case uncomfortable is that it implicates more than just the individuals in the file. It implicates a diagnostic culture that still, in practice, requires a person to be visibly broken before they are taken seriously, and that has consistently failed to build frameworks for conditions that are invisible, internally experienced, and high-functioning on the surface. Most of the people in this file have never sought help, not because they aren't struggling, but because they looked at the available options and correctly concluded that nothing was built for them. Ask yourself what else we're missing because we haven't built the vocabulary yet. Case closed. If you've spent years tending a world that no one else can see, one more real to you in some moments than the room you're sitting in, you're exactly who the Deviation Archive exists to investigate. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next case file.